Now, I fully realize the election is over, and I've been down for a minute, and I've meant to get some of these thoughts out while the election was still on, kind of incoming, but and process these things out. I just couldn't find the time. I am working now, but the job that I have is pretty time consuming, and it's a labor job, so it allows me lots of time to think about these things and process them. But anyway, um, expressing some of the things about the election. Now, of course, we all know what the outcome is now. And so some of the things are going to seem like, well, why didn't you say these things beforehand? It might have influenced my decision. Oh well, the outcome's already known. Anyway, one thing about the election this time, as far as in contrast to previous elections that I've at least witnessed or been a part of, observed, is I have been very deeply disturbed in like my deep places regarding the amount of divine attributions that have been utilized throughout this process. And by that, what I mean is claims of divine appointment on really both sides. I've heard it from both sides, but far more so from the red side of this election, saying that God has ordained for Trump to run and eventually win this election. Of course, this is going to sound kind of funny now because of the fact that we know that he won the election, but of saying God willing, or when the bullet nearly missed him, and or how God preserved his life. He even mentioned it in his victory speech a couple of different times, that he believed that God had appointed for him to live, or this kind of stuff. Like, I've been deeply in my soul troubled by that, and how not just him, like, of course, everyone, Christian or non-Christian, tends to view whatever happens as God's will for their life, just as almost like fate. That's pretty common. That's not unusual. And just with how kind of ham-fisted he is with language and so forth, like, it's not surprising to come out of his specific mouth. But even J.D. Vance, his VP, making similar claims. Other people that are in his kind of his corner, Tulsi Gabbard, people that would say that they are devout Christians, saying these things about him, people that have advocated for him, that are on his side but not a part of his cabinet, like Charlie Kirk, Michael Knowles, of course, from Daily Wire, people like that, as well as various ministers that have thrown their hat into the ring about this stuff, saying essentially that kind of same stuff, that God has appointed him, has ordained him, has commissioned him. I've heard it said a dozen or more different ways at this point. I'm troubled by that. Like, that's a lot of really heavy duty language being thrown around in a very clumsy way. And of course, because he won, it makes it seem like it's far more valid than I think that it ever was, or far more warranted than it ever was. But quite frankly, especially the ministers, pastors and such that were saying things like that, they should know better. In fact, many of the denominations, like the mainline denominations, Assemblies of God, Southern Baptist, United Methodist, and so forth, like this, like, as part of their doctrines and covenants, the Roman Catholic Church also says that part of their their printed statements of faith is that they're not supposed to do things like that. It is specifically forbidden, and in fact, making political claims for or against a specific candidate could cause your 501c3 to be revoked. Now, I don't know how many people know that, but it can put that in danger. And basically, that would be the end of most churches because, of course, churches really can't function in a for-profit manner. That's a whole other subject, but for the most part, like they should not be saying things like that. They should not be speaking that way. Mark Driscoll has definitely gotten my hair raised as I've heard different things that he has said. And that's kind of his whole shtick. 95% of his shtick is just saying things that really no person with the level of influence that he has should ever say. In the same vein as the way that like Andy Stanley speaks, just not on the same subjects. Just it's serious. Like this is not a small deal, at least not where I'm concerned. I don't think it's right. I think it's actually very wrong to be talking about this. John Cooper in his podcast is making a lot of comments that I would put in the same category as well, just to make sure that I'm spreading my criticism as widely as possible so no one thinks that I'm somehow some weird bias giraffe or something, but sticking my neck out, whatever. It's just they should know better in a lot of ways, just should know better. I don't know why it is that it was allowed to slide the way that it has been throughout this time. I think in some ways the cost of victory was the financing of the soul. I think that that's kind of the way it's gone, of that people mortgaged their souls, of their ministry, of their churches, of their influence and so forth, in order that they would be able to secure a political victory. And I wonder about the consequences of that, the cost of it that will come up in the future. How much it's going to cost, because quite frankly, these parties don't care about your individual values whatsoever, insofar as their ability to manipulate those values into you voting their candidate into office. They only care about winning the election, and this just happens to be the strategy that they chose or capitalized on in order to win this one. Anyway, another thing that has, of course, been a controversial aspect of it is the idea of being pro-life was not on the Republican platform this time, which, of course, essentially was the thing the last couple of elections. In fact, it was considered to kind of be the linchpin that held together Trump's first electoral bid, that of course also was successful. And I want to mention a couple of things first off. The first is, I think from an essential aspect, or from a kind of a spiritual aspect, not in the like I'm a Christian spiritual, of the spiritual as in like the spirit of this thing, as opposed to the letter of it. I think that it really comes down to that, or a strategic aspect of it is that they just think they won the issue. They won with the overturning of Roe v. Wade last year. They just took the victory lap and moved on. Whereas the blue side of the aisle didn't think that they thought that if they can get their candidate in, who is very pro-choice, Kamala has always been very pro-choice, that they could potentially get that decision reversed again. And so that was kind of one of their central platform planks. Republicans basically just, we all, like, as if they had won that battle and then just moved off of the field and uh, moved on with their lives. And um, in some ways, like, I can understand that logic. Like, there's other things that need to be done. They need to advance past it. That's behind the lines at this point. Like, we've secured it. Like, I understand that logic in some ways, but kind of lends to an idea of kind of complacency that I, I have trouble with. One of the reasons that we're in the situation right now, it just culturally, is a level of complacency and apathy that the political center has had over the last couple of decades. They've kind of just let things slide in a liberal direction so long, it might not be possible to drag it back. So that concerns me. Just that simple idea of apathy that is being demonstrated there potentially. I don't like that. I don't think it's good for people to behave that way. But on the other hand, there are other things out there that are important to fight for. The whole gender and transsexual thing is something to be contending about for sure. And I think that that's such a loud debate over the last year or so. I think that that's kind of taken some of the thunder regarding the pro-choice stuff, almost like that, because it's more prominent. People are turning their batteries towards that and firing on it, and they are turning their attention away from the idea of babies are dying, as well as in some ways the work to reverse Roe v. Wade would be much more difficult. Kamala was kicking around the idea for a short time of the idea of an amendment to the Constitution, which would never, most likely, would never pass, wouldn't get enough state legislatures to ratify it to really mean anything. But that there's a bunch of trigger laws already in place in states like the one I live in Indiana, that it's functionally outlawed abortion, that if you want one, you have to go to Illinois or Ohio for it. And so there's not a lot that can be done to reverse Roe v. Wade without an enormous amount of work and kind of tyrannical overreach in that. So I think they're, in some ways, they're right to move on and just say, like, yeah, we're done with that. We won. We got what we wanted to get out of it. But we should recognize with that sentiment that they were only fighting for that so far as they felt that they could exploit it for votes. They were only fighting for it so far as they thought that they could exploit it for votes. Now that there's no votes to be farmed from it, they're not interested. We should learn from that about things that they want to try to feed you as a hot button issue in the future. Remember, they don't care about your values. They only care about your vote. And so, you're not going to figure out who I voted for, by the way, in all of this, but it's just been a lot. I've been very deeply disturbed as well about the idea of referring to our nation currently as more divided than ever, or even more divided than any point in recent memory. That's all inflammatory rhetoric. It's simply not true. Keep in mind, it's about 100 years ago, 150 years ago, we were at war with one another. North versus South, right? Like that happened. Like that's about as much division as imaginatively possible in a culture. Like it can't get really much worse than that. And yes, the wet, hot American summer that happened a while back with all those riots and stuff like that was bad. That was not a good thing. But organized, armed military formations were not firing on each other. Like just, I mean, rhetoric aside between the rioters and the riot police and stuff, like rhetoric aside, armed, organized military formations were not firing on each other. You know, like that's the way the Civil War was. So, like, we are not more divided than ever, nor are we more divided than really any point in human history either. That's all just rhetoric fed to you for the purpose of trying to make you despair, to give in to fear, anxiety, depression. That's what that is. Because you give into those things, you're more susceptible to manipulation, to exploitation. You're more suggestible. That's what they want. Remember, they don't care about your values. They care about your votes. And so, don't give into it. Don't give into it 2 years from now. Don't give into it 4 years from now. You're not more divided than ever. That's just not true. And in fact, the idea of trying to sell you that is really trying to turn you in such a way that you're going to be more opposed to them and that you're going to cling more tightly to us, whoever us is. And that's going to make you more easy to manipulate. That's what they want. They, whoever they are. And so don't give in. On the one hand, all of that should lend you towards or lean you towards more prayer, more Bible study, more seeking out of fellowship and community with other believers. More of all of that should be an inherent reflexive response to all of this. But I'm willing to bet probably wasn't this time. And unless you intentionally set out to do so in advance, it won't be next time either. So, something to think about. That there's been a lot. It's just been a big year. It's been a lot over this last year. And so we should definitely be grateful to God that soon this year will be over. November is supposed to be the month of gratitude. So let's reflect for a minute. As much as has been going on, there's a lot to be grateful for. One of which is the fact that Kamala didn't win. Like, I'm not a fan of either one of these people, but man, not a fan of either one of these people, but there was an awful situation that we were staring down, and didn't happen, at least not yet. So that's one thing to consider something to think about at the very least. Being thankful that the election's over. Being thankful that we're all still here. The church is intact. We can go to it this coming Sunday, worship together as believers in unity. There's food on the table. It might not be filet mignon, per se, for a lot of you, and for us either, but food on the table. That God has been gracious, faithful, generous to us all throughout the years, including this one. And that next year is only going to be more of God's faithfulness and grace and generosity. Grateful for those things. And with hope for the future.